So my name is Chuck, and I'm from Hokkaido University. And yeah, the title is the Untrained Native-Speaking Teacher Worth Even Less Than We Thought? Native-Speaking Teacher Endorsement of Folk Beliefs in EFL Education. And my background is in English education, and I've taught English in the United States, Taiwan, and Japan. And so the research that I do is also an outgrowth of these experiences. And the research that I'm going to be presenting here today is rooted in my research and my work in Taiwan and Japan. And so I would invite you, if you're not from those contexts, even if you are, to sort of think about how this might pan out in your own experiences or in your own settings. Specifically, I'm interested in beliefs about English education and foreign language education more generally. And so certainly, as the title implies, that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is some very important beliefs about foreign language education. I'm going to skip through these initial slides just in the interest of time pretty quickly. But, you know, if you think about foreign language education of any language, and certainly this was true many years ago, if you ask someone, you know, who's the ideal teacher? Who's the ideal model of that foreign language? They'd invariably say, well, of course, I want a native speaker. You know, if I'm studying French, I want a French person. If I'm studying German, I want a German person, and so on. But this assumption has really been called into question and I want to say really debunked in the field of foreign language education in the past 25 years, and particularly in English education. It's been criticized on a number of grounds. The notion that the native speaker is the ideal teacher. And in the case of English in particular, well, for one thing, who is the native speaker? Where do they come from? You know, English being a world language spoken in many different places, you know, who is that person? And you say, well, okay, you know, we're going to get somebody from the UK. Well, within the United Kingdom, there's a variety of Englishes spoken. So, okay, where, you know, this just keeps going. And then what about other places? Singapore, other places where people grow up speaking English. So this has really been called into question. It's been sort of, even the idea of the native speaking teacher, the native speaker, has really been really critically examined and sort of deconstructed. On the other hand, scholars have recognized over the last couple of decades that the non-native speaking teacher brings a special set of competencies to their teaching. So in particular, the non-native speaking teacher often shares the same language as their students, and so that they can draw upon this resource to explain things. Often they share the same culture. So, you know, they have an appreciation of the student's culture built in. They themselves are a language learner, and they understand what it means to acquire that language, the problems, the strategies, and they are also a role model. So from the student's position, they see the person who's a non-native speaker like themselves, and this is an attainable role model. It says, wow, you know, this person, that they've done it, you know, they've acquired this language, and I can too. And so all of these things together have really dislodged the native speaker as the assumed, the presumed ideal teacher. I'm skipping through what I just said. Nevertheless, the native-speaking teacher is still presumed to possess a couple of talents that are really unique to the native speaker, that they still have certain value. And present research indicates that among students, among parents, there's really two beliefs of value, lingering value of the native-speaking teacher. First, that the native speaker is a good model of pronunciation and conversation. that they really have kind of the market cornered on that. And second, that they're a good cultural informant. You know, you've got the native speaker there. You can get the information about their culture. Those two exact ideas are enshrined explicitly in Japanese policy, where the government, the Ministry of Education here, states, quote, "A native speaker of English provides a valuable opportunity for students to learn living English and familiarize themselves with foreign languages and cultures." The screenshot is just something that popped up while I was doing this work. It says, if you want to teach English in Japan, you just click. And because of this, the government, for example, operates the JET program. If you're from Japan, you know what this is. It's a government program here in Japan that brings in thousands of native-speaking assistant language teachers to work in Japan. So there's like 5,000 or 6,000 people on this program throughout Japan who are native speakers, mostly of English, and working in the public schools. My goal in the research that I'm going to be talking about today is to empirically examine the two assumptions about the value of the native speaking teacher that I just presented. So as a result, I have these two research questions that I'm going to be talking about in the presentation. How valuable are native speaking teachers in Japan and Taiwan as pronunciation conversation teachers? How valuable are native-speaking teachers in Japan as teachers of culture? And I need to add also that I'm really focusing on untrained native-speaking teachers, because the JET program that I mentioned, for example, or in particular, because this is the largest such program, more than 90% of the participants have no formal training in education as teachers, and any form of education. Even fewer have training in foreign language or English education. I employed a qualitative research methodology. I gathered materials teachers had created. I observed teachers teaching, and I conducted ethnographic interviews with teachers and analyzed this material to understand the things that they were doing in their beliefs that articulate with those two aspects of teaching. Results. First, talk about the speaking pronunciation part. The untrained native speaker in teaching. The untrained teacher, native speaking teacher in speaking. What my research indicates is that these teachers tended to support misconceptions about spoken language based upon folk beliefs. In particular, they ended up endorsing a prescriptive view of spoken English. I've got an example here. This is an example from a recent entrance exam here in Japan, a university entrance exam. And I know this is small, I'm going to read it, part of it. What you're looking at is portrayed as a dialogue between two individuals in English, T and S. They're talking about the Japanese economy. And so S says, "But a consumption tax rise will surely reduce your sales and maybe even bankrupt the business. Another friend of mine is really worried about this." T responds, "It's a possibility, but I am not losing any sleep over it at the moment." S responds, "That's good to hear. There have been so many people going through tough times after the earthquake on 11 March 2011. The people in the disaster areas certainly need a lot of financial assistance in the coming years. But I also think we should not forget other pressing issues. As I see at work every day, someone has to pay for the increasing costs of care of the elderly." It continues. There's really only one problem with a conversation like this. And the problem is that nobody ever talks like this anywhere, in any situation, for any reason, at any time. I think I've got my MP3 recorder here. If you'd like to borrow it, if you can go anywhere in the world and find a situation where people actually are talking like this, I'd like to see it. Linguists refer to this as prescriptive language. So the word prescriptive means, what's the word prescribe, right? It's somebody's idea of what language is or should be, but it's not grounded in empirical data or how people actually use the language. And basically what this is sort of an outline of the many ways that a conversation like that diverges from actual language use. I'm not going to explain all of these, but one of them, well, okay, for example, at the bottom, a conversation like this violates what linguists refer to as back-channeling norms. Back-channeling refers to when someone's speaking in a conversation, the other person is continually giving them feedback, both verbal and nonverbal, but a lot of it's verbal. So somebody's talking to you and you're saying, oh yeah, okay, yeah, yeah right, yeah, sure. In Japanese, wakata, wakarimashita, oh, so da ne, oh, you know, like that. There's all the back channeling, okay? There's no back channeling here. This is sort of like two people playing ping pong. It's like, I've got the ball and I talk. Then I give it to you and you talk. Conversation doesn't work like this. Okay, well, back to the untrained native speaking teachers. What was their reaction to this? Mostly endorsement. Why? So mostly they supported this as authentic language. Why? Well, first of all, I mean, they really did. The native speakers really modified their language to sort of conform to these sorts of norms, and there was a couple of reasons for that. First of all, a lot of them, the assistant language teachers were simply handed a text and asked to read it. And so, yeah, what are you going to do? Well, I refuse to read it. It's not authentic or something. And they just read it because that's their job. Second, they wanted to make themselves understood, so they engaged in an exaggerated foreigner talk. And again, foreigner talk, it's not a pejorative term. That's a linguistic term that refers to modifications in speech that people make when they perceive themselves to be speaking to individuals of lower language competency. Most importantly, these native speakers also conform to some folk beliefs inherent in these texts. For example, that good pronunciation was the enunciation of segmentals. That's another linguistic term. It simply means pronunciation, they believed, pronunciation is focusing on the correct rendering of individual sounds. That sounds right. It's like, of course, you're going to speak a language, the individual sounds. There's a lot more to speaking a language than focusing on individual sounds. And also individual sounds in most languages, and especially English, don't matter as much as these folk beliefs would indicate that they do. So, today is Thursday. And I say Thursday. My dad says Thursday. Some people say Thursday. Some people say Thursday. Some people say Thursday or Thursday. So there's like 6 different ways to say it. And so if my friend says to me, hey, Chuck, let's have lunch on Thursday. Oh my God, I have no idea what you're talking about because you didn't say Thursday. Well, of course I understand perfectly what they mean because of the context. So individual sounds really don't matter as much as some folk beliefs would indicate that they do. By the same token, if you take a couple of sentences like, what's that in the road ahead? What's that in the road ahead? The individual sounds are basically exactly the same, but there's 2 completely different meanings there. So this is a myth about individual sounds being the only important thing. Here in Japan, and I interviewed people, these teachers, and asked them about their pronunciation teaching, and they just kind of, gave this sort of a response. They said, well, I need to teach my students to pronounce L and R. And I don't know if anybody's ever really been misunderstood because they mixed up an L and an R. I'm going to eat some lice. Oh my God! It's like, I know what you're talking about. And the other important thing about this is that this focus on the individual sound was at the expense of many other things that are also aspects of English pronunciation. Let's skip through. The teachers did have these native-speaking teachers did have some reservations about these dialogues, but it was interesting that even aside from cases where they were asked to read the dialogues, for example, when these teachers were actually spontaneously producing their own language in the classroom, that they tend to produce very inauthentic language. And so I've got an example here. This is actually an interview. It wasn't a classroom, but I was interviewing this one teacher, and I was talking to him, and I said, you said that you sometimes you make English more simple and you stress the important words. And the guy says, yeah. And I said, can you give me an example of that? And I would like to play the recording of him, but I need to protect the identity of my informants. So I'm going to say this the way that he said it. So he's talking to his class. He says, sure, so let's see. Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Who's hungry? Hungry. Who's hungry? And then he said, well, who's sleepy? Who's excited? Who's happy? Like that. And the problem with that is, again, nobody ever talks like that. It's inauthentic, okay? Now, beyond the question of whether or not that sort of inauthentic speech may or may not be valuable pedagogically, my question for this research is really, why go to all the trouble of finding a native-speaking teacher if they're not going to talk like a native speaker? So it sort of really adds to this kind of debunking the value of the native speaker anyway. The second result has to do with culture, and so this dovetails nice with Dr. Frawley's presentation. And I couldn't find a good slide about culture, so that's Culture Club. But as with the case with speaking, the untrained native speakers in this study also tended to support misconceptions about culture based upon folk beliefs. One of them was tokenism, and many of these teachers were themselves tokens. Basically tokenism is you pepper a textbook or a workplace or a commercial or an ad campaign with an underrepresented person to give the appearance of being progressive, multicultural, international. And the teachers themselves were very much in this position. Most of them were tokens rather than mainstream stakeholders in the Japanese schools. Most were non-Asian, they were especially white, so they were highly visible. They were peripheral, most were recruited as temporary workers. People in the JET program were limited to 5 years, so you're like a mainstream worker. And they didn't really engage the workplace in the same duties as the Japanese teachers. So the tokenism. Second was essentialization of culture, which it's this idea of boiling culture down into a few key aspects. So, once, sushi and wearing a kimono and the cherry blossoms, once you've got your brain wrapped around that, that's Japan. Take your shoes off before you come into the house. So it's these little trivial aspects of culture that sort of are used to represent the whole culture. And, the untrained native-speaking teachers were engaging in this in their teaching as cultural representatives of their own cultures. So they shared these sorts of beliefs. And again, the textbooks also reinscribed these beliefs. So you have this kind of a circular dynamic going on with the textbook and then the untrained native speaker and these beliefs being sort of recirculated. And you really do get this sort of McDonaldization of culture. You get this sort of culture-tainment idea, packaging and marketing of culture. The ALTs, the assistant language teachers, often did presentations on holidays, for example. Tell us about your culture. Well, we celebrate Christmas and, Santa Claus comes. And And the native-speaking teachers were often placed in a position as spokesperson for an entire culture. Tell me about American culture, or tell me about Western culture, or tell me about foreigners. Stereotyping and idealization of culture also accompanied this. This is another behavior that I saw manifest in the native-speaking teachers, the way that they taught, created materials, and talked about what they were doing in their teaching. So, as most of you probably know, the left one is Norman Rockwell. And Norman Rockwell was an American painter who was famous for his depictions of 1950s Americana. Of course, everyone was white, middle class, Protestant. And if you go on Google, like Google Images, and you type Norman Rockwell parodies, you get this kind of stuff. And so the point here is, this is the idealization, and people say, well, it's not really like that. So they're having evidently their Thanksgiving dinner with the turkey, but in reality, it's a bucket of KFC, and there's a few beer cans on the table, and so on. People are wearing their hats. The NS teachers, the native-speaking teachers in this study, often reproduce dominant or hegemonic discourses about culture. Christmas celebrations is a great topic. All real, fill in the blank of any English-speaking country, all real Canadians, Americans, celebrate Christmas and furthermore do so in a similar way. When I celebrated Christmas when I was a kid, we drank beer, watched football, and told dirty jokes, but you don't see that in the textbook. Finally, there was a tendency among these untrained native-speaking teachers to put forward big C culture as representing culture. And this is an old model, but there's the notion of big C and little c culture. And I think it's useful for sort of thinking about these things. Big C culture is, valorizes the arts. Festivals, traditional clothing. So, when people say, well, I love French culture, they're almost always thinking about big C. The wine, the Louvre, the food, the Eiffel Tower. This sort of a folk belief, this sort of a point of view which was manifest in these teachers, ignores little c, or unconscious culture. An example would be, how far away should you stand from a person when you're having a conversation with them? This varies culture to culture and subculture to subculture within a nation state. So, depending on your culture, subculture, there's different distances. Another one is, what's the appropriate volume to have a conversation with another person in a public place? It's an example of little c culture. And the thing is, these little c culture things, these are the ones that cause conflict. I think you'll agree. Well, God, that guy got right up in my face. People from country X are really pushy. And what it is different interpersonal distances. Tolerance for silence is another example. I could only count to 10 before I couldn't stand it anymore. Examples from native-speaking teachers. Schools would have a culture day. So you had to have the fish and chips. And this is an example of a current Japanese textbook, so same thing. So it says, Unit 4, My Beautiful Community, Traditional Culture. And they have 4 different matsuris, so that's culture. These are government Ministry of Education approved textbooks. So again, focusing on big C culture at the expense of little c culture. Okay, getting close to the conclusion, so discussion. First of all, untrained native-speaking teachers conformed to prevailing prescriptivist folk beliefs about English education. due to their lack of training in important concepts, and particularly pronunciation and culture. Just being a native speaker does not give one the insights into language and culture that are the field of the specialists. So this is why we have linguistics. This is why we have anthropology, because how do conversations really work? What does it really look like? What are the functions of hesitation sounds like and This is what linguists study. And they study this because if you ask people, they just parrot these folk beliefs if they're not specialists. I think there was another problem, though, sort of a danger of legitimization of these misconceptions about language via the native speaker's stamp of approval. So, the native speaker is brought in as the expert, and I began by saying, the native speaker is viewed as an expert on pronunciation and on culture, and then for them to be saying these things is simply reinscribing a lot of these misconceptions and folk beliefs. And it's ironic because actually what should be happening is the opposite, that those people or any teacher should be trying to disrupt these sorts of beliefs. But in fact, it's exactly the opposite, and quite depressingly, you can almost come to the conclusion that, in many cases, more harm is being done than if they didn't even have a teacher. So, recap. Yes, the untrained native-speaking teacher is worth even less than we thought. In East Asia, the thinking manifest in the literature is that although the untrained native speaker may not be able to explain the grammar of the language or use the first language of the students, they still have value that the non-native speaking teacher does not have because they're authentic models of speaking and pronunciation and cultural norms. The research presented here suggests that even this much more modest rationale for the untrained native speaking teacher is open to serious question. And finally, this project has really been limited to the content or the epistemology of English education. So what is the English, okay, the culture, the pronunciation. I haven't even gotten into harmful misconceptions about pedagogy or language acquisition, like how do people learn languages. That's a whole different thing. I've got some data about that. But there are similar misconceptions about how people acquire languages that are sort of folk beliefs. That if you have someone who's not trained as a foreign language teacher, one of the most famous ones is that errors are bad. When we recognize errors as a normal part of language acquisition, a necessary aspect of language acquisition. Recommendations? Eliminate prescriptivist language in formal teaching materials. Well, that was easy for me to say. In favor of teaching the way that people, native speaker, non-native speaker, mix, are really using the language. Get the MP3 recorder out. How are people actually using it? It's just a shock that so little of this is done. That foreign language textbooks, I think across the board, government approved or otherwise, you just look at this. Well, we have the phrase textbook language. Oh, well, that's just textbook English. And that phrase is not new, but things haven't really changed. So we have this prescriptivism. And by the way, it's not that language is somehow, that's proper language, and then people are actually just speaking slang or informally. That's not true. Linguists understand that that's what prescriptivism means. Again, is I think I already mentioned, this is a language nobody ever uses anywhere. It's not that it's formal. Nobody ever uses it. Extend the focus on culture to the little c forms, using that old model, and disrupt cultural essentialization and stereotyping. Disrupt the tendency in education to valorize cultural norms of the privileged in society. I'm working on another project right now that's about English education and the visual culture, and looking at how people are placed in relations of power, how it reflects relations of power, these advertisements for English education, and the role of whiteness, things like that. So, it's this notion of privilege being recirculated. All of the above should be included in the training of language teachers and the selection of texts. And people who are trained foreign language teachers do get, exposure to this to varying degrees. Hire more diverse foreign teachers and recruit from places besides the inner circle countries. Inner circle means the traditional English-speaking countries. So, for example, the JET program in Japan touts itself as an internationalization program, and yet, I don't say virtually all, but it's certainly not representative in any way of the English-speaking world or the international world. That concludes my presentation this afternoon. Thank you.